Hey guys, welcome to lesson 17 of theme 5, GCSE Geography. This is the penultimate lesson in this theme, meaning second to last. We've just finished looking at large-scale ecosystems, comparing the rainforest ecosystem with the African savanna grassland ecosystem. So what we need to do now is look at a small-scale ecosystem, and we're going to use British hedgerows, which may sound strange, but they are their own ecosystem. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to list the reasons for hedgerow disappearance and identify why they are so important to people, to making money, to jobs, and to the environment. And then we're going to evaluate sustainable management strategies for protecting them. So pause the video here a moment, go ahead and write down the title, please, and we can get going. Okay, so first of all, what I'd like you to do is if you copy and paste this link into your internet web browser and watch this video briefly, it outlines what has happened over time to the woodlands in Britain. An awful lot more of the UK used to be covered in forest than it is now, in deciduous British woodland. Where did they go? Why were they removed? Okay, so put a little subheading, British woodlands, where did they go? And then watch this video clip, and when you come back we'll make some notes together. So pause the video here a moment and watch that clip, please. Okay, so hopefully what you sort of noticed from that video was that British woodland started to be cleared around 2,000 years ago to make way for farmland during the Iron Age, as people advanced more and more with their farming techniques, basic farming tools. We branched more and more into producing our own food on a wider scale as population began to grow in Britain. So woodland was cleared to make way for agricultural land. Mostly hawthorn hedgerows were planted to mark boundaries between farmers' fields. In total, we're looking at around 200,000 miles of hedgerows across Britain, of hawthorn hedgerows were planted. So the woodland was cleared to make way for farmland, and then hedgerows were planted to mark boundaries between that farmland. As more and more woodland disappeared, the animals that were living in that woodland then turned to the new hedgerows as a backup habitat. Obviously, when you're talking about larger mammals like deer, that's not so much the case. You won't find a deer hiding in a hedge, but a lot of the bird life, certainly a lot of the insect life, and smaller mammals like mice and things like that, the hedgerows became a crucial backup habitat when they lost their original home when the woodlands were destroyed. So write down those quick couple of bullet points and then we'll move on. Okay, so it may seem strange that we're talking about a hedge as an ecosystem. So why are they even important? You've got a little handout, I think it says why a hedgerow is an important source or something. So you can either print that if you're able to, or you can handwrite the points that are on this slide. And what I'd like you to do is, if you've printed it, highlight in 3 different colours, or if you're writing it, write it in 3 different colours. I'd like you to categorise each bullet point. If it is important to people, so it's socially important, if it's important to the environment, or if it's important to people and the environment, then sort of do it half and half. Okay, so for example, marking boundaries, that's not an environmental thing, that's purely a human thing. This field belongs to me, that field belongs to you. So according to my key, this important to people, I would write or highlight that one in blue. You can use any 3 colours you like, the colours here don't necessarily have any meaning. So I'd like you to put a subheading, why are hedgerows important? Choose 3 colours and either highlight on a printout or write down by hand, categorising these reasons as to why hedgerows are important, please. So pause the video here a moment and do that. Okay, so this is the rough categorisation that I came up with. You may have made slightly different judgment calls, all right? You may have coloured things slightly different and categorised them slightly differently to me. Don't stress about that. This one, for example, absorbs agricultural fertilisers, preventing them from entering streams and rivers. Some of you might have even put that as both, because it would benefit people because it wouldn't contaminate our water system and our water supply, as well as obviously rivers being an environmental thing. As we know, vegetation is a carbon sink. It absorbs carbon dioxide, so it does us a massive favour by taking in all the pollution in the surrounding area and reducing climate change. Alright, so that's the sort of categorisation that I went for. So hedgerows actually have a lot of background in British culture. They're used a lot for crafting and community projects. They're absolutely vital habitat. They absorb CO2 for us. And to some extent, they are still used by farmers to mark boundaries, fence in livestock, for shelter for livestock. And they're part of our heritage. Like I said, some of them have been around for 2,000 years or more. So if they're so important, Why are we cutting them down? Why are they being removed? So you can see here this graphical representation of the presence of hedgerows over time. Length of national hedgerows, so if you added up all the hedgerows in Britain, how long would they be? Alright, so up to 600,000 kilometres. You can see in the 80s we were around the 5,500, almost 600,000 kilometres of hedgerows left, and it's declining over time, and by sort of the start of the 90s we're down to nearly half that, only just over 300,000 kilometres worth of hedgerows left. So they're being removed for some reason, and these images kind of give you a bit of a clue as to why. When hedgerows were first planted 2,000 years ago, we didn't have machinery, and we didn't have wooden and wire fencing like we do now, and the farming methods and technologies are very, very different. Farming now has moved towards being much more large scale. Giant field upon giant field of monoculture, of the same crop being grown. So we've got larger fields now than before. It's easier to navigate with modern day machinery like combine harvesters if there's no hedges in the way. Fencing can be used to control your cows and sheep and whatever now. We don't need hedgerows to fence in your livestock. And we've got other options. Hedges aren't needed for shelter because we've got indoor barns and indoor facilities to store our livestock in over winter. Also, you guys probably won't remember, you're too young, but there was a concern quite a number of years ago now that badgers were making their homes in the root systems of hedgerows, and badgers transmit something called tuberculosis, and they can transfer it to cows. And farmers were finding that their herds had been contaminated with TB, and they had to kill their entire herd, which is their only source of income. So hedgerows were also removed to get rid of rats, badgers, other natural pests in the area that could threaten your livestock and threaten your crops. Also, if there's no hedgerows, you can use that bit of land to grow even more crops, so you're maximising your profit. And hedgerows, you do need to cut them, to maintain them. It takes time and effort. So you're removing that maintenance issue if you remove the hedgerows and just put a permanent fence in place. So put a subheading, if they're so important, why are they being removed? And then make this bullet point list, please. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is look at the impact, the effect of the removal of hedgerows. Now I'm going to change the slide and it's going to show you a flow diagram that looks a bit daunting to start with, but I'm going to walk you through it and then you're going to draw it yourself into your books. So, at the centre here we have hedgerow removal, the impact of hedgerow removal. In red are the negative impacts and in green are the positive impacts. Now straight away you can see this is rather imbalanced. So, it's mainly from an economic point of view that hedgerows are being pulled up, because it makes it easier to use machinery, there's more space to plant crops, and if you can use machinery more easily and more quickly and you can plant more crops, your harvest is going to be greater. That's your crop yield, how much the land gives you, and if you've got increased crop yield, you're going to get increased profit. So as usual, habitat destruction here is driven by money. But when you've then got that habitat loss because you've pulled up the hedgerows, there's no shelter for wildlife, biodiversity decreases, you could be looking at species extinction here as well. Also, with no plants, there's no photosynthesis, and this has a double effect. No carbon dioxide is being absorbed. When plants photosynthesize, they take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. We call that the carbon sink, and if that is lost, all the carbon dioxide that would have been absorbed by the plants remains floating around in the atmosphere, so it's going to increase climate change. Add to that plants, when they photosynthesize, they also release transpiration. They release moisture into the air. So if you rip up the hedgerows, there's no plants to photosynthesize, there's no transpiration, less moisture in the air, and it could actually, in the long term, cause the climate to dry out. In addition, you've now got no roots or branches. So what that's going to mean is there's nothing to intercept any of the rainfall and slow it down from reaching the soil. So the soil will become saturated very quickly. That means no infiltration, too much surface runoff, which will increase the flood risk, and that surface runoff could wash away the surface soil erosion. And if you lose your soil, you can't grow anything. In addition, there's no plants, there's no hedgerows to absorb and block the extra fertilizer that's spread onto the land. So that fertilizer will get washed into rivers and it messes with the river ecosystem. It causes something called an algal bloom, which is where green algae grow in like a blanket over the top of the river or over the top of the lake, and it blocks out the sunlight. And without sunlight, the plants in the river or the lake can't photosynthesize, and plants are the basis of the food web. So the whole ecosystem, the whole food web collapses because algae grows and blocks out the sunlight on the surface of the water. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video here a moment and go ahead, and I would suggest taking plenty of space for this one. Make a colour-coded flow chart of the impacts of ripping up our hedgerows across Britain. Okay, so if we're not careful, even though hedgerows are a small-scale ecosystem and we don't really pay them any mind, it's just a hedge, if we're not careful, it could have a global impact, a national impact, and certainly a local impact and an environmental one. So how can we still allow farmers to make lots of money, but in a way that reduces this impact on the environment? There are a few strategies, okay? Now you've got them on the Sustainable Strategies handout. What I'd like you to do is summarise the information from that sheet into a table, okay? And in that table you're going to have an overall description of how each strategy works, what the upsides and downsides are, so you are evaluating, and any other extra info about why hedgerows are important or what might be the main points of how these strategies work. Okay? So this is what your handout looks like. You've got a few strategies here. The Hedgerow Regulations Act. Very basically what this does is it says that you are not allowed to rip up a hedgerow without permission. So it means you've got to put in writing why, when and where you want to rip up a hedgerow, and it has to be approved, and only then are you allowed to touch the hedge. If you break those regulations, the fines can be thousands of pounds. You can actually get taken to court. TPOs, tree preservation orders, this is where particular trees within a hedgerow are protected. You can't touch them, but it doesn't protect the rest of the hedge. Only certain trees that have that order placed on them. Fair to nature, we're saying the reason the hedges are getting ripped up is because farmers want more farmland to make more money. What Fair to Nature does is it offers grants. It gives free money to farmers in return for leaving their hedges alone. So it encourages farmers to leave the hedgerows intact, and the money they would have got had they been able to farm extra crops if the hedgerows weren't there is balanced out by the grant that they're given. There's a couple of other things down here called coppicing. Coppicing is where you do have to cut your hedge. It grows. It's plants. So you do have to cut the hedges at a certain time of year, but if you cut them at the wrong time of year, you're going to destroy birds' nests, you're going to destroy fruit on the hedges, which is food for the other animals in the food web. So coppicing is where you educate farmers to only cut at a certain time of year and only cut in a certain way so that hedges grow back stronger and healthier every year. The berries remain there for the season, the birds are allowed to breed for the season before you do any cutting. And hedge margins, a margin is a gap between something. So it's literally where farmers are encouraged to not plant any crops too close to the hedges. And it just gives hedges a bit of breathing room. It allows the root system to be better established and you have a healthier hedge. It just tells you a little bit in here about the kind of animals that live in the hedgerows, dormice and things like that. All right? So take this resource, print it out if you can so that you're able to highlight or underline key points. But if you're not able to print it out, just use it off of this slide to copy and complete this table. Take a whole page, turn sideways. I've put a few points in to get you started, and this is the last task for this lesson. So pause the video here, copy and complete this table using the resource that I've just walked you through. Okay, and that is lesson pretty sure that should say lesson 17 done. The last thing to deal with for theme 5 is how we use ecosystems for energy production. So next lesson we're going to look at Swansea's Tidal Bay Barrage scheme that keeps getting the go-ahead and keeps getting stopped. We're going to look at the upsides and downsides of it and how much renewable energy it would actually produce and therefore potentially help to reduce climate change on a global scale. As usual, if you have any questions, drop me an email, gleesona@hubcymru.net. I've got my emails open every day, so I'll get back to you as quickly as I can.